Hello and welcome to this Getting Started series for Silhouette Paint with me, Ben Brownlee from Boris Effects. Paint can be used for a lot of different types of tasks, including skin work, tattoo and object removals, extensions, or just cleanup from other automated processes, such as a chroma key that's not quite working, or more advanced automated processes such as Mocha Pro's remove or content-aware fill. Now obviously the big advantage in working Silhouette Paint is its hybrid paint system. We have the advantages of the speed of a raster-based system and also the flexibility of a vector-based paint system without the inherent lagginess or problems that can cause. And if you're working as part of a bigger system, being able to move your Silhouette Paint projects between different hosts is a huge advantage as well. In this video, we're going to be doing a number of things to this shot, including extending the buildings and cleaning up brickwork down here and adding in a bit more of an interesting sky. And the idea of this is to show you just one workflow of how you can use Silhouette Paint. We're not going to be going deep into every single tool right at the start. We have other dedicated videos for that, but I'm going to give you an idea of how and why you would want to use Silhouette Paint. So let's take a look at our original footage. And this looks a little bit strange, you can see with the little bow down here. And the reason for that is that it was shot with a quite wide angle lens and I have undistorted it. So we are going to redistort it towards the end and it's going to look a little bit more like that. But there's a good reason for why I've done this. When we're dealing with paint, we often want to prep the footage before we even make any changes to it or before we start actually painting on top of it. So this could mean correcting for lens distortion, or if you have noisy footage, you might want to do some noise reduction before you take it into paint. Anyway, so let's bring this into Silhouette Paint and start to take a look at that. So Silhouette Paint is applied as any normal plugin. So I'm going to come to Effect, Boris Effects Silhouette and Silhouette Paint. And we have a few options here about how we want to have our controls, but this doesn't really look like much because what we want to do is open up the Silhouette Paint interface itself. And I'm just going to click on Open. And it's going to prompt me to start a new project. Silhouette Paint projects are stored separately from our main host project. So this gives us a bit of resilience to host crashes. It also means that we can transfer this same project between different hosts. So you could start work in After Effects and move this over to Nuke, for example. So if we look at our new project settings, the first thing we have to do is give this a name. And I'm going to call this one Staring Towards Buildings, which is the name of the clip. And I'm going to call this one Extend. Make that one big. And then we say where we're going to place this. So if we hit Browse, we can then go into the regular Finder or Explorer and choose wherever we want to save this. I like to keep things ordered and have a folder just for Silhouette Paint projects. So I can go in here and I can select that folder there. Now when working with Paint, we can work either in 8-bit, 16-bit float or 32-bit float. Now I'm just working with 8-bit source footage, so I'm going to keep my working depth in 8-bit. And as I alluded to earlier, if we already have a project in progress, we can open a project up right here. I don't, so I'm just going to go Create Project. And we're now in the Silhouette Paint interface. Now, I'm not going to overwhelm you with going into depth about what every single one of these buttons does. I'm just going to work through this project and show you the stuff that we need to look at. Now, there are other videos which do go through these tools in a lot more detail, so you're not going to miss out on any important information there. So let's just do a brief look at the UI. Now in the middle we have our main viewer. Now this is where we're going to be doing most of our work, so surprise, surprise, it is the biggest part of the interface. Underneath we have the regular transport controls, so I can play this forwards, play it backwards, step one frame forwards, or go to the end or beginning. We can also see our start frame over on the left hand side here, our end frame on the right hand side, and the current frame just over here. Now just underneath the start frame we have a little drop down menu which shows how we're going to play things back. We can either play things in a loop as we did before, or we can play things through once, boom, and then we'll just stop. Or my favourite one is to play things as bounce. So as this gets to either end it will just play it backwards or forwards, just to shuttle back and forth between those two stops. Let's find a frame where we're going to start working. Okay, we're going to start about here. Now on the left hand side we have our selection of tools. As I click through these, you'll notice that down at the bottom we have a contextual control as well. So if I go for something like just the regular color tool here, our controls are going to reflect those different parameters that we can use. So I'm going to just come in here and I'll select a color, I'll select a blue, and I'll just talk you through what I want to do with this shot. We're going to make this look a little bit more stylized, maybe a little bit more sci-fi, and I'm going to extend the buildings up here, maybe even more, maybe up here somewhere. What I also want to do is I want to even out some of these things as well and get rid of some of these little problem areas, and maybe even get rid of some of the greenery that we see there. And I'll select another color down at the bottom. And I also want to give us a new sky as well, and the sky is going to go all along there somewhere. Now notice that as I'm painting, we have a list of strokes growing along the bottom here. So this is our paint history, and we're going to revisit this because this is going to be extremely important later. But for now, I'm just going to Control Z and just undo some of those strokes. Now next to my parameter controls here, I have the brush profile. So this controls things like the size. So it's looking a bit bigger. We can see that over there. We can change the opacity. So how this paints on. There we go. And we can even change things like the shape of the brush. So I can take the flatness up, maybe change the angle of that, change the fall off. That gives me a different profile for the brush. Now for some of the most common things we have with the brush, we have keyboard shortcuts for. So if I hold down Control or Command, I can make my brush bigger or smaller, change the size of the brush there. I could also use these square brackets, open and close square brackets to do that on the keyboard as well. And if I hold down Shift along with Control or Command, I can change the softness. So if you look down in the profile down here, as I scrub that back and forth with the pen or the mouse, you can see that changing up. That's going to be a lot softer for us. And finally, next to all of the controls, all the parameters, you'll see this little box icon. If I click on that, that will reset those parameters to the default values. And so now we have our regular brush back again. All right, let's just undo all of that again and actually get started with this project. So let's get the first bit of our shot done now, which is to extend out the buildings. And I'm going to use another tool for this. I'm going to use the clone tool. And if I click on the clone, you see we have a brand new set of parameters down at the bottom. Now cloning can be as simple as holding down the Shift key, clicking to set our source and dragging it over to where the destination wants to be. And then we can just sort of clone over onto our other area there. So Shift, drag, clone. And this sort of thing works fine if we're just cloning from one easily definable area onto another. Say, for example, just to clean up that mess over there. But here, when we're trying to do something a bit more complex and actually shift the buildings across, we have another mode that we can go to. So if we look down at the parameters, we actually have different views of how we can preview what's going to happen with a particular brush. And these views aren't exclusive to the clone brush. Some of these views work with all the tools as well. Now, the first one is to do this sort of onion skin. And I could come in and I could offset things here, or even do the Shift and drag and move that into place. And that works out all right, and turn that off. But of course we have so much more that we can do with this. We don't just have offsetting in space with the X and Y. We can offset things in time as well, which we'll do later. We can also scale things up and down, and we can change rotation and corner pins with it as well. So to make this easy for us, we have this interactive mode. So if I turn on interactive mode, I get these new controls which allow me to transform, rotate, skew if I need to on these areas here, scale up or scale down a little bit there, and even change the corner pinning as well. So just by clicking and dragging on the edges. And in this way, I can make sure that everything lines up where I need it to. Probably around about there, maybe. So if you look at my cursor now, as I drag around, you'll see where I'm cloning from and where I'm going to. So I can make this cursor a little bit bigger, pan around holding the space bar and then just moving the mouse or tablet and then just painting that in. So I can see whether that's matching in what I thought it was going to look like or not. If I like it, I can keep it, or I can hit Control or Command Z and then just fit that into place a little bit more. So something round about there maybe. Cool, and that's going to look pretty good. And I'll just undo that for a second because I want to do more stuff with it. Because we're not just constrained to doing a simple, straightforward clone. We can come into Grade and Filter and maybe add a little bit of color correction to this. So I want to make this just a little bit darker. I can bring the gamma down a little bit. And that will just make that a little bit darker and fit that and make that sit back a little bit more. Maybe I'll undo that and do a little bit more there. I could also use auto grade if I was cloning blemishes. And what this does is it tries to sort of match the color that we've got into our source from our destination. So in this case, it won't make a lot of sense, but you can see that it's doing a very good job at matching those colors in to where I'm cloning that into. But we don't want auto grade here. I'm just going to turn that off and I'll slide my gamma down around about 0.7. There we go. We also have warping, but we're going to look at that in a different tutorial. So I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to change my softness a little bit, make that smaller, and just paint that over the top. I'm going to try to be relatively accurate, but we don't have to be 100% accurate. I'm using the plus and minus buttons now just to zoom in and zoom out, and I can come in and just fill in some of those gaps. So holding down Control to change the size of the brush, and I can hold down Alt and click the start point and the end point to make a straight line. Okay, and I hit F to go to fit, or I can always go to the top right hand corner and change the zoom up here as I want to. Now you notice that some of these lines are a little bit messy, and we're not getting exactly the sort of look that we're going for. We're not getting that nice clean look that we're going for. If I come up to the top and go to View, we can look at this image in different ways. We can look at the output, which is what we've got after the paint. We can look at the foreground, which is what we do when we bring this in. And we have other views, including color layer, detail layer, and paint layer, which shows us just the areas that we've painted in to give us different ways of looking at the image. I'm going to throw a couple more keyboard shortcuts at you, and it's just going to be the numbers at the top of your keyboard. So 1, 2. So 1 and 2 just switch you between foreground and output. So we can see, if I zoom in a little bit here, well, I've gone over some of these buildings where I didn't even want to. So I'm going to come into my eraser tool, and I can now erase those areas that I don't want. So we can do this in a couple of different ways. We can either be painting on the output layer, which is what we're doing right now, which works fine for a lot of this stuff. So I can get rid of some of that. Or if we've got these edges up here somewhere, where it's a bit difficult to see where the original edge was, all I have to do is come into my foreground view by hitting 2 on the keyboard, and I can even just paint on this view here with the eraser brush. So when I turn back into the output, you'll see that that now gives me a nice straight line. I'll do the same over here. So I'll come to where I want to erase it, so I know where my areas are. Come back in here. And I'm going to clean up some of this sky as well, even though we are going to be coming in and replacing all of the sky. Just going to clean up the worst little bits here. Just kind of fade this in a little bit. So when that's done, we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And it does look like those buildings have been extended up a little bit. Looking all right. The next thing we have to do is clean up some of this area down here as well. So we looked at the different views up here, and I showed you the color layer and the detail layer. So what these do is they break up our image into the detail layer, so the frequency layers there, and just the color layer here. So if we check out what the detail layer is doing, all of this area down the bottom looks rather similar. It looks sort of like a brickwork pattern. The difference comes, of course, in the color layer, where we can see all of this sort of green stuff that is reflected in the green stuff, and the algae that's gone over all of these bricks over the course of a few years, it looks like. Now in Silhouette Paint, there is a way of painting directly onto either the color or the detail layers. And that's down in this area in the bottom right. So we can choose to paint in all of the color channels, the RGB, or just RGB separately, or just paint in the alpha channel if we had a clip with an alpha channel in it. And we choose how we're going to paint. So whether we're going to just paint normally, or whether we only want to paint on the color or the detail. So if I just choose color here, and I go back to my color tool, if I choose a little pink color here and just paint over the top there, you can see we still maintain the detail underneath that changed color. So how do we use this to clean up things like blemishes or algae in this case? Well, it's really simple. We can right click anywhere and that will sample the color that we right click. If I click and hold with a right click, I'll get an average of those colors. And now, just by painting in the color channel only, down the bottom right here as we had it, I can now come in and very quickly just paint up and change all of that algae that we were seeing previously. And I can sample a few different places and just quickly clean all that stuff up. I can even take the opacity down a little bit. So take that down to about 80%. And we maintain some of the color that we had in there previously. So if you leave me to it for a second, I will come back with a nice painted area. And here we are, and we'll do a quick before and after, before and after. So that's certainly a lot easier than going out with the pressure washer and giving that a big old soak. Now obviously there's also times where you just want to be cloning out detail and leaving the color alone, and we can do that just at the bottom here, but we're going to save that for another time. Another one of the common tools that we have is the Blemish tool. And the Blemish tool is usually used for fixing, well, blemishes, obviously. And the Blemish tool comes in two parts. If I just show you what the default thing does there, what the Blemish tool does is it blurs an area and then adds in a bit of noise over the top to kind of hide the fact that you've blurred it out. Let's just undo that. Now the important thing to do with the Blemish tool is to make sure that that noise matches, because if we zoom in here, you can see that that noise pattern doesn't match what we have in the rest of the image, and it makes things stand out like a sore thumb. Zoom out a little bit there. So luckily we can control the noise across the red, green and blue channels separately, and we can view the red, green and blue channels separately as well. So I can flick between red, green and blue and the alpha channel, which we don't have. We'll just start with the red. So if you cast your mind back about 10 minutes where we started looking at the clone tool, we looked at these compare modes. We were looking at onion skinning for the most part, but we can also do things with a horizontal or vertical split. And these will show us, let's just zoom out a second. These will show us what our image is going to look like after the tool has been applied. So if I zoom in, back in there again there, we can compare the noise that the Blemish tool is going to add with the noise that we have already in our image. So we have our before and we have our after. So I can now come into my amount and I can bring that down to probably around about 1 there. And I'll do the same thing on the green and the blue. We probably actually only want 1 or 2. I'll go 1, 1, 2. That should be around about right. And I'll come back up to my color channels and I'll click on the white at the top, and that'll give us all of our color channels back. So now we've got the compare back and forth. So I can turn my horizontal split off, find the area that I want to use the Blemish tool on, and click on that, and we've got rid of that area. Come over onto this one here, use a brush that's just about the right size for what the blemish was, and just do one simple tap. And I can do that for any blemishes that I see down here. We often work with this on skin, but it can be good on other areas as well. Anything else that's standing out to me? No, I think that's pretty good. All right, so far we've looked at the Blemish tool, we've looked at the clone tool, the color tool, and the eraser tool. I'll look at two more related tools before we move on to the next area, and that is the dodge and burn tools. Now, the dodge and burn tools are useful for making images lighter or darker. So I've used the dodge tool to begin with. You can see if I drag over the top, it makes my area lighter here. And we have control over the range that it's working on, whether it's working on midtones, shadows, highlights, or whether it's working on the entire image. Now, the dodge and burn tools are useful to build up a bit of local contrast, to make things sort of stand out a bit better, or to relight a scene a little bit. For example, if we wanted to make this look like it was in a bit more direct sunlight, we'd have to have a few more shadows, because our shadows here are all very soft. It looks very much like a sort of flat scene, which if you look at the sky down there, yeah, it looks very overcast. So here's something cool we can do with all of our brushes. If I come into my brush profile, I have two boxes that we haven't looked at. We've got airbrush and we've got buildup. Now airbrush, if I turn, actually I'll show airbrush with a stronger color. What airbrush does, if I click and hold, it builds up that brush at 30 frames a second. There we go. So working a bit like an airbrush would. We hold down the trigger and an amount of paint sort of squirts out. But we also have buildup, and this is what buildup does. So if I have my brush set to 50%, I click and sort of go back and forth over the top, this is always going to end up at maximum 50% opacity, because my opacity is set to, well, 51%. So I have this set to build up and do the same thing. So I click and go back and forth. You can see that now builds up to 100%. So this is really good for building up sort of bigger effects. So if I come back to my dodge tool here, and I'll take the opacity down really quite low, maybe to something around about 6%, and hit build up. And I'm just going to go over the top and just gently take a few little strokes over the top of the edge of the buildings. And do the same up here. And it almost looks like I'm doing nothing. And I'm going to do a similar sort of thing on the sides there. So sort of build that up a little bit. Just kind of make a little wedge shape. And now you can see I'm starting to build in a little bit more highlights into those areas. And I'm going to do the opposite now. I'm going to use the burn tool. But before I do that, I'm going to save my dodge tool as a preset. So any brush and any tool can be saved as a preset. So hit save and go to 1. I can now come back to this any point in time with these exact settings. So if I come to my burn tool now, and maybe I'll take the opacity up a little bit on the burn tool. Definitely make sure the build-up is still there. And I'll come in and I'll just go over the areas where there should be shadows. Just a little bit here. You start to see that building up. So now, if I go between the before and after, you should start to see there's more shadows coming in over on the right-hand side here. I'm going to save that as a preset. It's preset 2. And I can use Alt and then the number to move between these presets. So I'm just going to dodge and burn a little bit and just try and make this look a little bit more sort of stylized and metallic, a little bit more painterly. And here we've got the before and the after. Before and after. So that's starting to look pretty good. I mean, obviously we could do a bit more, but I think I'm happy with how this is working for now. And I'm just going to come into my paint history and I'm going to name this group Building Extension. Just so I know what I've done here. And it also gives us an idea of how many paint strokes we've done, because this is a big thing about silhouette paint. We've now worked on this for a little bit of time, so obviously we've built up quite a few paint strokes. Now, if we were doing this in a vector-based system, the more paint strokes we do, the more pressure we put on the system resources. So it's easy to get to a few hundred paint strokes, but your system starts to feel like molasses. Now, that doesn't happen with Silhouette because Silhouette is a raster-based system, which means that we're dealing with pixels like we would do in Photoshop. The big difference between Silhouette Paint and Photoshop, once we save and close out our file within Photoshop, all of the history and undo levels we had are gone. Those are flattened. If we do the same thing in Silhouette Paint, if I come out of Silhouette Paint and come back into After Effects, we can see our painted shot. And if I open up the project again, we still have all of the strokes that we were working with previously. And I can come in to delete some of these strokes if I need to, or add to them at any point. And all of those strokes are recorded in my history. So in this way, we get the speed of raster with the flexibility of being able to see and remove strokes at any point that we have with vector paint. Now I'm happy with how our building extension has worked. Now, as we'll see very shortly, I could ask Silhouette Paint to paint the rest of my frames up, but that's not always the most desirable way of doing things. Because we don't have any big lighting changes or movement happening within our buildings themselves, it's actually just going to be far easier and faster just to motion track this in as a single static frame. So that's what we're going to do. So to create a single static frame, back in After Effects, I'm going to come into the Silhouette Paint parameters and go Hold Frame, Enable. I'm also going to freeze frame. So we now have a single frame going over the top here. And I'm just going to motion track and mask the buildings off. And using the miracle of editing, this will go very, very quickly indeed. And we're back with our motion tracked in paint. So here's what our paint looks like. And here's the before of the shot. And here's the after. There we go. It's starting to look like something. Now we're going to work further on this shot now because we're going to be doing a sky replacement. Now, obviously there are many ways to achieve this type of effect. For example, tracking in a still or using masks. But by using paint, we're able to carefully control the amount of blending and fall off between the original and the replacement sky. We can also clean up the sky effect as well if we need to, directly within our host, which is something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do easily. So I already have a sky that I've created, which is called Clouds Rolling Slowly. Let's have a little look at that. It's some clouds. They're rolling slowly. And we have a little bird going in there. Maybe we'll see if we can bring the bird in as well. You'll also see that I've already painted out some of the buildings that we had obscuring the view down at the bottom. So let's bring our clouds rolling slowly down into the scene. Now, because I'm going to apply another paint effect to this, I'm actually just going to pre-compose the layers that I already have. So that's going to be the original and the buildings paint layers, plus the track matte. So I'm just going to have those selected, pre-compose, move all of those in, and I will call this one Buildings Extended Pre-Comp. Something nice and simple. There we go. Now onto this pre-comp, I can add another copy of Silhouette Paint. Now I'm going to open up the optional clone sources here, and we can choose up to 2 different input sources coming into our Silhouette Paint. And we choose those just from other layers that we have down in our comp. So I'm going to choose the clouds rolling slowly, and I'll leave that source, and I'm going to open up the Silhouette Paint project. Now, because this is a new instance of Silhouette Paint, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to have to give it a new name, and I'm going to save it in the same place as the last one. And I'm going to call this one Buildings Extended Sky. And create that project. And we're back in the Silhouette interface. Now, as we saw before, every paint stroke that we make in Silhouette Paint is recorded. And this makes it easier to go back after the fact, make changes, and then come back out. Something we obviously can't do with other raster paint systems. But what this paint history also allows us to do is it allows us to paint across frames. So we can do manual paint on one frame and then auto paint across the rest of the shot. And to do this, we actually need to have some motion tracking. Silhouette Paint consists of two modules. We have the Paint module, the one we've been working in up till now, and we also have a Roto module. Now this Roto module can be used for a few different things. For example, limiting where paint is going to be applied to, and also motion tracking in our paint itself. Now the layout itself is fairly similar in terms of the fact that we still have our tools on the left hand side, but we have this new thing on the right hand side which is called our object list. There's another video that goes deeper into motion tracking, so we'll skip some of the details and I'll just show you the broad strokes of what we're doing here. So I'm going to just create a shape and I'm going to apply this into a layer, because whenever we're doing any sort of motion tracking, it has to be applied to a layer. And I'm going to call this one Buildings Track. I'm going to come into my motion trackers, and I have three different motion trackers. I've got a point tracker, a planar tracker, and the Mocha tracker. I'll just change my motion module to perspective, leave everything else at default, and then just track that forwards. And once I've done that, you can now see that I've got my layer motion tracked, or I have the motion track information applied to my layer. And to test this out, or to do other useful things with it, I can always click on the stabilize up at the top here and click on active layer, or just play that through. And what we should be able to see, if this is good motion tracking data, is that this stays perfectly static and the rest of the frame moves around, which it does. So we know that this is good motion tracking data. If you have a copy of Mocha Pro, you can also export out silhouette tracking data directly from Mocha Pro. And I happen to have one in the clipboard here. So I use Control or Command V. That will bring in my tracking data. I can make another layer, hit apply on that. It will apply that corner pin data, and I'll call this one Mocha Track. And we still have this stabilized around the active layer. So if I hit play on that, you can see that that is also being absolutely rock solid. So now I'm confident with my motion tracking data, I can come back into Paint and check out our clone tool one more time. Now back in the parameters of the clone tool, we can choose a different source. We always have the option of either cloning from the foreground, which is the original clip that we bring into Silhouette Paint, or the output, which is the result of all the paint strokes we've made up till now. Now, because we've also piped in another input, I can also choose that input in the source here. And if I turn on interactive mode, this shows me my input. And I can do lots of fun stuff with it. I can, if I wanted to flip that around, all I have to do is go scale -100 in there. I can just move that around where I need it to go to. And we can still scale that up a little bit because we do have a bit of movement in there. So I might need to add some scale in. I'm not too concerned about what's going on in these absolute corners, because as we saw right at the very, very beginning, we are going to be re-warping the lens distortion again. So I'm just going to make sure that my clouds fit in the right sort of place. And there's one more thing that we need to make sure that we do when we're cloning from an external source using motion tracking. And that is to use source match move. So without source match move, if I just scrub this along, you'll see that my source stays in exactly the same place. If I have source match move turned on, you can see our source follows along with the clip. Also see that bird is going to cause a bit of trouble, so I'm going to see if I can hide that as much as I can behind her head. Yeah, that still is going to look good. Also want to make sure these clouds are going to fit so we can much more easily kind of blend these together. I think that's going to be all right there. All right, so now we've made sure that we've got transform turned on and is matching up with the motion tracker that we want it to. We've got source match move turned on as well. I can come in and start painting this up. So I'm not too fussed about what's going on in the top right hand corner because we are going to be distorting that out. Now, for the sake of speed, I'm not going to get completely carried away with making sure that everything is pixel perfect, but I do want to get a nice kind of blend here. And that's, you know, that's really is the purpose of doing this type of sky replacement within Paint, because we do have every single stroke available to us. I'll come in and I'll just erase a little bit over the top where I know her head's going to be, so I don't want to have to do too much work with her head. And maybe erase just a little bit up at the top here as well. Just clean that up just ever so slightly. Yeah, that's looking all right. That's looking all right. We can, we could spend a bit more time with this, but I think we're going to be just fine. And just as a good habit, I'm going to save my clone setup now as a preset. All right, so if I'm happy with this on one frame, let's transfer that to the rest of the frames. So I'm going to come over to my auto paint, come into my paint history, and I will give this group a nice name. This is another excellent habit to start to work with, to label up our different groups, because especially once you build up a few groups together, things can start getting a little bit tough. Great, so now that's all done, let's auto paint this across the rest of the frames. And to do that, we just have the group or groups selected that we want to auto paint. We choose what type of frames we're going to be working with. We've got all frames working here, so I'm just going to leave this at all frames. I'm going to make sure that I turn match move on, and I'm going to play all of these selected events backwards. So let's do exactly that, and let's see what we get. And once that's finished playing that all backwards, we can then just play that through. Maybe we'll stick that in bounce. And we can see how that's worked out. I might want to give my bird friend a little bit more love, but I think that's going to be all right. So when I'm happy with that, I'll save that, exit out, and that's applied immediately back in our host. And just as I said, we're not really worried about what's going on in these corners, because if I turn on my optics compensation, scale that back up again, we're not going to see any of that at all. Then if I add on a little bit more color correction and possibly a little bit of grain, we end up with something that looks a bit like this. So that's an extended look of a typical workflow with Silhouette Paint. We've seen how we can use a combination of these various tools to paint up a set extension or a matte painting on a particular still frame, and then motion track that across the rest of the shot. And we've seen how we can paint on a single frame and then use Silhouette's auto paint to come in and do all of the hard work for us as well. But these, of course, are just a couple of ways of starting to use Silhouette Paint. To go more in depth about certain tools within Silhouette Paint, or to go in depth with certain techniques that you might want to use for particular tasks, then check out the other Silhouette Paint tutorials available on Boris FX website. My name is Ben Brownlee from Boris FX, and thanks very much for watching this overview of Silhouette Paint. And I'll see you again in another paint tutorial. Bye for now. Thanks for watching. If we've missed a topic you'd like to see, or you want to see Silhouette Paint tutorials for a different host, then let us know in the comments below. In-depth explanations and tutorials to get you started can be found in the Silhouette manual. And remember, you can download a free trial of Silhouette Paint from borisfx.com.